Hello everyone, this is your fair warning that this video will be containing some mature topics because we're going to be discussing biblical stories. Take this as your spoiler and your content warning. Thank you.
1, 2, 3, release them.
The Bible is the most sold and maybe also the most read book in the world, so it should come to no surprise that it has the biggest extended universe, sequels, prequels, fan art, and supplementary text of any book we have in the world. As it is also supposed to be the Word of God, you would expect it to be easy to understand, especially because one of the sequels introduces the canon of heaven and hell. You will either get unlimited riches or unlimited suffering depending on how you react and how you live your life in accordance to the text within the Bible.
Inappropriate.
Because it's apparently delivered by God, you would expect it to be easily digestible, but no. It actually has as many interpretations as it has readers. And if you've ever read the book yourself, you might actually agree with me there. The difficulty is that a lot of the writing within the Bible would make you assume that you as a modern reader is actually the one getting spoken to when you're reading this text. You can easily relate to some of these things that's written in there, so you would assume, okay, this applies to my life as I am living it now in this time period. But the reality is there are so many layers to the Bible that we cannot even hope to understand without learning the historical context in which these texts were written in. This is to say that people did write some beautiful stories and some outright dubious and despicable narratives to explain certain events that happened within their history. It was a dreaded different time, so obviously we can't judge them, but we can still learn from them. This video is going to center around being gay and its relationship with the biblical text, but if you are very interested in this, I'm going to put some videos below that you can watch to explore more of how the text of the Bible was compiled. With all these caveats out of the way, we can move on to the gays.
Pussy like girls. Damn, is my pussy gay?
Being gay or homosexuality is one of the most contentious topics within the biblical community because it is widely believed that Big Daddy upstairs condemns it, which means that anyone who follows Big Daddy must also condemn it themselves. I suppose I can't really fault them on this because on the surface it does seem like they are against what we now see as homosexuality and what the ancients saw as something perverse, and really quite foreign to a lot of them. These people lived in a time where there were much less tools to explain what was going on around them. They had no understanding of science, modern medicine, pens, cars, rose toys, hell, they didn't even have soap. Yeah! To explain to these people the biology and psychological factors behind sexuality would have them looking at you like you were insane. They would think you have the mark of the devil, the mark of the devil. A lot of the narratives within the Bible is an attempt to explain a lot of the biggest questions we have within humanity, such as where we came from, what our purpose is, what do we need to do, what are we made of, but without the tools warranted for some of these observations to be fully measured and understood. With that said, it's still not as straightforward within the text with its condemnation of homosexuality as you may think. There are many layers within this conversation, so we must peel them back like an onion in order to really get into what this conversation is truly about. First, we need to understand that our idea of modern sexuality is not what they understood to be back then. Now we look at it through the lens of hormones, desires, preferences, but back then they understood it as dominant versus dominated. And because they lived in an even more misogynistic society, they saw it as unbecoming and unnatural of a man to be dominated. There are even ancient Jewish texts that says that men should not be on the bottom during intercourse, even with women, because then he is giving his power away to that woman. Fellas, is it gay to have sex with your wife? Pause. I've done some further reading on this and I've discovered a couple things. A lot of these ancient Jewish texts only really refer to people and their wives, not necessarily just women in general. And as much as a lot of them say that the wife's consent does matter, it does say that the man may do whatever he wants with his wife. Even comparing it to how you would eat fish or how you would prepare roasted beef. It's not as archaic as I thought, so that's good, but here you go, you can even have fun reading some of these texts. But this video, like I said, is going to be about homosexuality, because I'm incredibly saddened by how many people think that it's genuinely a choice, and because it's written in this book, a sin, and that we should not have space within society because of that. A lot of Bible translations include the word homosexuality itself within the text. But an interesting detail is that homosexuality as a word and as a concept came about during the 19th century, so there must have been a different expression used for it back then. Or a different descriptor of the kind of activities that would fall to what we now understand to be homosexuality. Usually when the word homosexuality is used in modern Bible translations, it's using it as a kind of catch-all term to describe male penetration and male receiving penetration, bringing it back to the whole dominated and dominant thing. The interesting nuance to that is that these are happening usually within the guise of prostitution, and that means that there's not really a relationship within the two people here. Because back then they couldn't even account for men and women falling in love with people of the same gender. That means when we see the word homosexuality, we're reading more into it than even they understood back then. Not only are we now including women's same-sex relationships, but we're also including romantic relationships of consenting adults. A lot of relationships in those times included what we would now classify as pedophilia because often older men chose much younger male or female partners. Pederasty was a term the Greeks used to classify an older man taking a younger boy under his wing, often practicing sexual acts in which the child would be the recipient. This was so common that even figures like Socrates practiced this. Hellenization gave that practice more visibility with the ancient Hebrews. The writers of the scriptures had this as their motto for same-sex relationships, which is incredibly troublesome for us now reading this text. With those details out of the way, let's continue on with the onslaught.
Moses said, "My Lord, I lifted your staff as you commanded me."
Gay!
One of the most cited stories for me growing up was the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and how that proves that God doesn't fuck with gay people. That particular story is found within Genesis 1 through 11, but there's literally the same version of it in Judges 19, but be warned, that one has a crazy conclusion. And in the sequel, Jesus Strikes Back, there's also Jude 7 that says, yeah, fuck those gay people. So now we really are presented with the question, what did the men of Sodom and Gomorrah do? In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, apparently the two angels residing in Lot's house were welcomed by every male within that town via gangbang. They knocked on their door and say, hey, let me have some of that angel ass.
Nani?
There is also a layer of this that's very interesting because even within the Bible, it's really odd for an angel and like a regular human being to be interested in any kind of intercourse. It's kind of seen as unnatural because those are holy beings. Genesis 6 has some kind of layer to that, and other apocryphal books kind of go into that as well. But that's besides the point. This is also against the laws of hospitality that you have within the land. You're supposed to be more hospitable and kind to foreigners, especially when they haven't really posed a challenge or any danger to you. There's also a detail to this that we often overlook, and it's that within both the stories in Genesis and in Judges, the guy who opens the door is like, don't these angels, just take my 2 virgin daughters. If we're following the story beat by beat, if someone threatens to fuck your guests, you should just give them your virgin daughters instead. Damn it, I don't have any virgin daughters. Don't get me started on the fact that people say that it's a different time and all of that. If we're to understand that God is timeless and God doesn't change his mind and that God doesn't make any mistakes, we would expect that he would be okay with you, offering up your daughters if you get threatened, I suppose. Or your guest gets threatened. There's layers to this. I'm going to call this one a wash because we have one step towards condemning what could be homosexuality, but then in this case it's also gang rape. And another step back because the men in these stories offer up their daughters or their wives, as long as they're virgins, because we don't give a fuck if they're not virgins. And if you're interested, the only other time that Lot's daughters are mentioned are in Genesis 19, and go read that for yourself because you're not gonna like it, I guarantee you. Hilariously, Google has a line summarizing it saying, believing they were the only people left, the daughters conspired to ensure their family line continued. Well, that's great. With that amazing note, we're going to move on to the next verses. Leviticus 20 verse 13 and Leviticus 18 verse 22 both have some flavor of condemnation of homosexuality. The wonderful thing about Leviticus is that it's a law code, which means that we can look to other laws within there to see what God is really about. In Leviticus 25 verses 44 to 46, we see the distinction in how you're supposed to treat foreign slaves versus Israelite slaves. Yes, God literally means love your neighbor, but only your neighbor because you can go to other neighborhoods and get slaves from there, that's fine. And also, you can treat them worse. These verses are both equally in Levitical law, so if we're to condemn homosexuality in this case, we must also be okay with what it's saying about slavery. And I really hope that none of us are okay with what it's saying about slavery. Now, the Bible condoning slavery is such a long conversation, and I'm going to put some videos down below for you to further understand what it actually looks like. And obviously some of the defenses that people come up with when it comes to how to justify a lot of the verses that talk about owning slaves. I'm going to call this one a wash because I'm not following Levitical law, and if you live in a free nation, you're probably not following it either.
I can have a
Gay.
feeling? Sure.
1 Kings 14 verse 24, 15 verse 12, and 2 Kings 23 verse 7 has God smiting some male and female sex workers. Back in the day, only men were really seen under the guise of being able to buy sex, so this could be a condemnation of homosexuality, right? But the interesting thing about the sex work angle is that the Bible has a really odd relationship when it comes to sex work. For example, in Genesis 38, it goes into one of Jacob/Israel's son, Judah, and how he accidentally buys a prostitute who also happens to be his daughter-in-law. That's another crazy story. Read it if you'd like, but there's definitely some misogynistic and suspicious goings-on when it comes to the world of prostitution in the ancient times. Buying and selling within prostitution can either get you smited, but if you're one of God's favorites, it can get you to be one of the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel, so good for Judah, man. With that said, I don't know what to make of these verses, and you can make of them what you want because they're under the guise of prostitution. Which back then, their only understanding of it is that it's transactional and that women are objects, so it's okay if you take advantage of them in that way because these are not virgin women that you care about. And usually they're foreign women. So maybe we'll give it a point. Who knows? You decide. Romans 1 verses 18 to 32 has Paul blabbering about what's regular and normal and natural for men and women to do sexually. Paul is such an interesting character because there have been decades of debate within biblical scholars and church fathers as to which ones are his legitimate letters within the Bible. Obviously, if you're a Christian, you probably believe that all of them are legitimate letters, so we're gonna kind of go between them as if they're all legitimate in this video. But yes, I understand that there are debates within the community as to which ones are legitimate because a lot of Paul's beliefs kind of go wishy-washy between some of the letters. With that said, in 1 Corinthians 11 verse 14, Paul also says that it's natural for men to have shorter hair. Damn. What this tells me is that this man has a very shaky understanding of what it means to have something be natural and unnatural. This is obviously because there's no scientific understanding of what naturality is back then. They kind of understood it to just be the way of things. It's normal societally for men to be expected to have shorter hair, therefore it's natural for them to, right? So much for Jesus, man. I liked his hair long and flowy. Regardless, in this case, I don't really care for what Paul thinks is unnatural and unnatural because clearly his reasoning is just his personal preference. In this specific time period within the ancient Jewish religion, it was more common for men to have shorter hair because they were Hellenized back then. They were under the Roman Empire. What that means is that he saw a lot of men with shorter hair and that he saw a lot of men exercising what we call pedestry. Look into that if you want to. The short of it is that a lot of older men back then would have relations with younger boys. Yeah, I don't want to get into that right now. And that was his idea of what it means to have a male-male relationship, right? Let alone the fact that women barely get talked about in this, right? Because like I said, it was a more patriarchal, misogynistic society, so they cared very little about what women thought. Speaking of his letters, in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 11, he also condemns prostitution once again and a bevy of other sexual sins. It's also really interesting because later on in the letters, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8 to 9, he also says that it's better to stay celibate so that you can stay away from sin. He recommends that you only get married if you really, really and truly cannot keep it within your pants. This is because Paul, like Jesus, is very apocalyptic, so everything he did, he was doing with the understanding that the world was literally going to end tomorrow. He's like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. The world is literally going to end. Everyone stop what they're doing. This is also why Jesus continuously encouraged his followers to go ahead and give away their belongings. That's because he genuinely thought that the world was going to end tomorrow. With that said, the world hasn't ended, and we've clearly loosened a lot of the sexual morality we have behind Paul's words, and even Jesus' words. Jesus says something along the lines of, if you've even had a thought of lusting after another woman and you're married, that's already adultery. Obviously, we've loosened that. In Romans, Paul's speech was meant to compare the ancient Jews with the ancient Romans. He saw that the Romans practiced pederasty and had looser roles when it came to their women, and thought that to be unnatural. What isn't someone's natural role was incredibly moralized, as this was their way of controlling people's behaviors because they had no objective way to create social norms. Of course they're going to think being straight is how we're wired, considering a grand majority of people are straight, and this is how we are able to reproduce. Now that we value people more than just their utility and their ability to reproduce, we're able to study the factors behind human sexuality. We can see that Paul's reasoning is flawed. It also needs to be said that he is comparing his culture as a Jew to that of the people who took over his land. Of course he's going to think his way of life is superior. It also helps to build disgust with the Roman lifestyle as he's trying to convert Gentiles to the Jesus movement. In Corinthians, Paul uses illicit sex as a way to describe prostitution, which we've covered. It's usually not consensual, it's not a proper relationship, and it only benefits one party. We can hardly compare these situations to relationships of queer people now. Also remember that this is a time period in which if you have certain illnesses, they're fully just going to think you're possessed by the devil. Their reasonings are going to be flawed for sure. Let alone them saying barely anything about lesbianism and women's relationship with each other. They kind of just say that women are being unnatural with their sexual desire, and I don't know what that means, and they probably didn't even know what that means. I have seen some readings that it's like women don't want to give birth anymore or want to get pregnant anymore, and if that's what they meant, psh. Paul mentions the gays again in 1 Timothy verses 8 to 10 because he's quite obsessed with us, and I love him for that. So Timothy, like Corinthians, uses the terms arsenikite, which Paul uses to join two Greek terms found in the Leviticus passages we addressed earlier. This is because Paul had access to the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of some Hebrew scriptures. In this case, arsen means man or male, and kite means bedding someone, and he seems to use it as a term for those who top during male-male intercourse. He also uses the term malaki in the Corinthians passage, which refers to soft men, because they are the ones receiving penetration. That said, Paul's not mentioning relationships in which two people love each other, let alone anything when it comes to other genders of queer people. Note that I don't speak Greek, so this is my secondhand understanding of explanations of people that do, so it's best to do some further reading or watching, and I've linked some videos below for you to learn more. Before I uninterrupt myself, I need to say how hilarious it is that Paul can join two terms like this. It's like reading, "Thou shalt not lay with a femboy" in the Bible. So what's actually happened throughout the centuries is that we've broadened the idea of what it even means to sin in this case. We're adding relationships between consenting adults into this, and we're adding relationships between women into this. And in that Timothy verse, he also condemned slave traders. Woohoo! But not slave owners. Aww. I'm just gonna give him a little slap on the wrist for that, but you know what? He's not ahead of his time, that's okay. He does also say in Ephesians 6 verse 5 to 9 to obey your masters if you're a slave. I know in a lot of the New Testament it's very kumbaya, slaves and slave owners are all equal under God or whatever. They never say don't have slaves. They say that when God looks at you, you're equal, but they never say for you to actually be equal in this world on this earth. You get to decide what you think about Paul in this case. If you want to look into which ones are his disputed letters and which ones are his undisputed letters, you can go about it that way. A lot of this is really going to be up to you because, like I said, the Bible has as many interpretations as it has readers.
I can excuse
Slavery.
but I draw the line at
Homosexuality.
You can excuse
Slavery? For such a widely debated topic, these are really the only verses we have even referencing homosexuality within the Bible. And if you're super duper keen, you've noticed that Mr. Jesus Christ himself said nothing about the gays. The point of this video wasn't really to change your mind about what you think about gay people, and I don't even know that I can do that, and I don't even know that God can do that. What I mean by that is that when people come to read the Bible, they already have their set beliefs within them. They don't read the Bible as a child and then set their beliefs based off of that. Very often they're born into a religion. And with these already existing beliefs, it's not going to matter what the Bible actually says, nor what any church father or God himself might even say, right? If you don't fuck with the gays, I can't make you fuck with the gays. That's your own journey in your own time. What I think most of us can't argue with is that most, if not all of us, do not follow what the damn book actually says. And that's a good thing, actually. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Exodus have some of the craziest laws you've ever seen, such as getting your daughter to marry her rapist if she's, guess what, a virgin. If she's not, you can, have him pay you out. That's okay. Only if you're the father. And that beating your is okay as long as they survive because they're, guess what, your property. Yeah. And I'm gonna presume if you're watching this video, you do not agree with these things. And don't argue with me, Jesus never said anything about changing these laws either. Jesus himself says to keep the law as it was back then, except for the one about divorce, which he retcons, and I'm not really sure why. I guess that one's kind of nice. Giving women more power when it comes to divorce and all that, that's quite nice of him, but the slavery and the daughter and the whatever stuff, that's all the same to him. I've listened and exposed myself to hours and hours of biblical scholars, Christian and not, talking about these topics. And what I've really garnered from it is that we must take what is in the Bible with a grain of salt.
I just want to say, I'm part of the LGBTQ community, and this is my best friend, Valentina. She's an ally. Talk, Valentina.
Ally.
The ancient Hebrews, much like us, view the world through a lens, and for us to understand that lens, we must study it in order to see a clear picture beneath. Fortunately, we have more tools now more than ever to study the values and lifestyles of these ancient Hebrews. Unfortunately, a lot of what they thought and they wrote back then is archaic to us now, which means that it's really uncomfortable to discuss the lesser known stories within the Bible. But don't be discouraged, because it doesn't stop us from taking what we're still comfortable with, dusting it off, and saying that it's inherently correct. Meanwhile, tossing everything else aside only for church fathers, biblical scholars, and of course YouTubers to discuss, because that's what God would have wanted. There are many videos, books, campfire stories, lessons, what have you, that discuss and go into these lesser known stories. And if you're interested, you can look into it yourself, or God forbid you read the damn book itself. If you do, I challenge you to make it through Genesis with a straight face, and I bet you can't do it. We need to establish that the Bible itself is not univocal, which means that God himself, itself, themself, did not come to earth and narrate these words on the page. And no, it didn't send its magic gigantic finger in order to write whatever is written on the page either. What did happen is that over the years, influential religious leaders or their scribes wrote down what their oral traditions were and oral stories were based on the culture that they were in. These stories were an attempt to obviously explain what was going on around them. Like, why do they have lightning? Why do they have flooding? Why do people starve? Why do people go to war? Things like that. They're trying to explain things and put God into it in order to create an even grander explanation that could motivate their people. And yes, a lot of these stories started as oral traditions, which means that it's older than writing itself. And because we are fallible humans, a lot of the details get lost, and a lot of the details also get aggrandized in order to put more emphasis into what people should really believe and should really put their thought into. This is also why neighboring civilizations have even older stories that are very similar to stories within the Bible. Because also plagiarism was anything back then, you could really just, I relate to you, so we have the same story, that's nice. But of course, there could still be truth within these stories, but we can only really measure them against what we can observe and measure in our life right now. The scripture must conform to our reality and not the other way around. Imagine being given a math problem and you're trying to solve it with an equation that clearly doesn't work. This is when you try to find an equation that does work. And when you have an equation that works, you must then get rid of the equation that doesn't. It just simply doesn't fit. Of course, when it comes to religion, it's not objective reality, so there is that kind of subjectivity behind it, and that's where all the nuance gets really difficult. It was written through a timeline of around 1500 years, so you would not expect its writers to have a set of unchanging beliefs. And spoiler alert, they don't. The oldest Hebrew scriptures were often taught and orated to the followers of this ancient Jewish religion. These stories are not often orated by eyewitnesses to these things, but they are orated by people who are seen as having an authority within the church and that they can teach the people how to follow this religion effectively. But these people did not have the Bible the way that we do now. Hell, more than 96% of the population back then could not read or write. The scriptures from this time period that stuck are now called the Old Testament, with the New Testament being a sequel that came hundreds of years later when Daddy sent his son to come back home. The idea of the Bible came about around the 4th century when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire.
Wow. I hate it.
And even after then, it took decades and centuries even of debates between church fathers as to what gets to be in and out of this Bible. It is quite important, I think, for a lot of Christians to know how these texts were compiled, but I would bet that a lot of people don't get to know this and don't get to hear about it within churches. You would think it would be important, but I guess not. Everything in these ancient texts is up for interpretation, and if it were up to me, honestly, we can write better laws to base our societies off of. And we have. Hence why we don't base what your country believes in off of religion. We've actually already realized this, but we're holding on to this book like this with a tight fist because we're so scared. And I think that's that fear that's holding us back, the fear of heaven and hell, like I said. But when we understand that this book, much like has evolved over time, and our understanding of God and theology of what it means to believe and to follow these rules has also changed over time. This is not all to say that the book is meaningful. I don't think we should get rid of the book. I just don't think we should base our society off of the book. I really like the Bible. I think it has a lot of really great writings, and the history within it is rich if you really go ahead and study it. The study of the Bible has actually been bogged down by religion itself. Because when you have dogma, something that you cannot question within a religion, it doesn't matter what the book actually says because you already have beliefs that you cannot question and you cannot change. It doesn't matter what archaeology shows us. It doesn't matter what more understanding of the ancient language even shows us. You already have your beliefs and no one's going to change your mind about that. If you're going to take anything from this video, I would just like you to consider releasing yourself of the shackles that is the belief within a specific religion, saying that the Bible says this very specific narrative and only this narrative. Contrary to popular belief, you are actually able to take it or leave it when it comes to the Bible, much like any other book we have. This is not the only book with a scary heaven and hell dichotomy. So many other religious texts have those things, and we're not nearly as fearful of them as we are of the book that we know about. The more you know about religion, the less fear you're gonna have, and that's really my message in this video. Learn more. Multiple different religions, not just the one that you know about. And what you'll realize is that they have similarities within them and similarities within the societies that created them. Our societies have evolved since then, and I think our religions should too, honestly. And please be wary of your sources, especially when you're listening to people who would benefit from your beliefs or your membership in their church. I mean, shit, be wary of me. Regardless, if you've watched this video, thank you so much. If you're homophobic, I wish you would stop, but I can't stop you, and that's actually wonderful because that means you also can't stop me from being gay. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Learning is great. Reading is great. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Bye-bye. The mark of the devil.